In recent weeks, the entire world has been closely watching an extremely alarming chain of events unfolding along global maritime routes and directly affecting the planet's energy security, namely, how the United States has been intercepting and detaining oil tankers one after another, linked to so-called shadow fleets of sanctioned countries that continue to transport oil in circumvention of international restrictions. These operations are officially presented as a fight against illegal trade and violations of sanctions regimes, and formally, Washington is acting within its own law enforcement logic. At the same time, as analysts note, at the initial stage, the US tried to act with maximum caution, avoiding crossing red lines and not directly infringing on the interests of other major powers. Even incidents involving vessels linked to the Russian shadow fleet, according to sources, were effectively smoothed over at the highest level in order to prevent uncontrolled escalation and a direct clash of interests. However, despite this outward caution, the Donald Trump administration has nevertheless crossed a line by affecting the interests of a player for whom such actions have a fundamentally different significance: China. According to insiders in Asian diplomatic circles, the actions of the US caused genuine shock in Beijing. Chinese officials view the recent detentions not simply as a blow to shadow schemes, but as an attack on an entire supply system that is directly tied to China's energy stability. These are tankers that do not formally sail under the Chinese flag, but are embedded in a complex network of affiliated companies, insurance structures, intermediaries, and port operators oriented precisely toward the Chinese market. These vessels transport oil from sanctioned countries, primarily from the Middle East and Latin America, and ultimately a significant portion of this raw material ends up in China, providing its industry with cheap energy resources. According to sources, it was precisely the fact that vessels logistically and economically tied to China came under attack that became the key turning point for Beijing. The main reason for Chinese outrage lies not so much in the status of these fleets themselves. Beijing fully understands that these are gray and often semi-legal schemes, but in the method chosen by the US. Instead of attempts at diplomatic pressure, behind-the-scenes arrangements, or informal rules of the game, Washington opted for the direct seizure of vessels, demonstratively showing that the rules of other players are not binding for it. In Chinese closed assessments, this is seen as a dangerous signal. If the US is prepared to forcibly intercept vessels linked to China's interests, then tomorrow other elements of global trade could also come under attack. It is here, insiders emphasize, that the situation takes on a truly explosive character. In the current realities, China remains the only power capable of systematically and on equal footing confronting the United States on a global scale, economically, technologically, and, if necessary, politically. For Washington, it is critically important to maintain balance in this confrontation so that it does not turn into open conflict, the consequences of which would be unpredictable for the entire world. And it is precisely for this reason that the latest steps of the Trump administration are perceived in Beijing as extremely risky. Yes, the US is demonstrating strength and showing who controls key maritime routes, but at the same time, it is opening a Pandora's box whose consequences may prove far more serious than the effect of one or even a dozen detained tankers. According to insiders, work on response measures is already underway in China. And this is not about symmetrical gestures, but about targeted and painful steps in which Beijing has extensive experience. The trade war of past years showed that China knows how to strike not loudly, but precisely, choosing the opponent's vulnerable points. That is why many analysts believe that the current escalation around tankers is only the beginning of a broader and more dangerous phase of confrontation, in which the stakes will only continue to rise. Now, the world can only watch where this chain of decisions will lead and whether the major powers will manage to keep the conflict within manageable limits, or whether we are witnessing the beginning of a new era of harsh power-based pressure in global trade, where China's response could become the next and far more serious step. Against this backdrop, Chinese analytical circles increasingly emphasize that what is happening around the seizure of tankers is not an isolated episode, but part of a much broader pressure strategy that Washington is beginning to apply ever more openly and demonstratively. According to sources close to Chinese state think tanks, Beijing views U.S. actions as an attempt to rewrite the unwritten rules of global trade through force, using control over maritime communications as a tool of political influence. Closed reports state that such an approach creates a dangerous precedent in which any country possessing naval superiority can unilaterally decide which trade flows are considered legitimate and which are not. For China, whose economy critically depends on the stability of maritime routes, this is perceived as a direct threat to national security. That is why, insiders claim, Beijing is already discussing measures to reduce dependence on vulnerable logistical chains, ranging from accelerated development of alternative overland corridors to the expansion of its own naval presence at key points of the world's oceans. At the same time, China is intensifying diplomatic efforts with other countries that also feel vulnerable to this kind of U.S. tactic, forming informal coalitions of the dissatisfied, albeit without loud public statements. According to sources, particular attention is being paid to states in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, for which the Chinese market and investment are vital and which are increasingly ready to support Beijing in its efforts to limit American unilateralism. In this context, China's response may not be immediate, but systemic and long-term, affecting several areas at once, from trade and technology to finance and energy. Analysts note that Beijing traditionally prefers to act not through sharp gestures, but through the gradual buildup of pressure, creating a situation in which the opponent faces multiple local problems simultaneously. This is exactly how China acted during previous trade conflicts, and this experience is now being actively analyzed and adapted to the new reality. In Washington, according to sources, it is understood that further escalation carries serious risks, but within the Trump administration, the belief is growing that retreat would be perceived as weakness. This creates a dangerous dynamic in which each side feels cornered and forced to move forward, even while recognizing the potential consequences. Experts warn that if the tanker-related conflict escalates into open economic or political confrontation between the US and China, it will inevitably hit the entire global economy, affecting supply chains, energy prices, and financial markets. Already now, according to insiders, major international companies are beginning to revise shipping routes and procurement strategies, factoring in scenarios of further instability. All of this reinforces the sense that the world is entering a phase in which even isolated incidents are capable of triggering global consequences. And the longer the current escalation continues, the higher the risk that another tanker seizure or a Chinese countermeasure will become the very event after which returning the situation to its previous framework will no longer be possible.